Introduction. Germany, 1943. The world was burning in the flames of World War II. Adolf Hitler's grip on power was unshakable, and the Nazi regime had spread fear across Europe like a dark shadow. Dissent was unthinkable, punishable by imprisonment, torture, or death. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, operated with terrifying efficiency, ensuring that no whisper of rebellion went unanswered. The streets were filled with propaganda, and radios broadcasted speeches of loyalty to the Führer. The German people had been taught that obedience was survival and silence was safety. Yet, in the heart of this oppressive world, one young woman refused to be silent. Her name was Sophie Scholl, a 21-year-old university student, a daughter, a sister, and a dreamer who once believed in the promises of her country. But unlike many around her, Sophie saw the truth. She saw the war for what it was, a monstrous machine fueled by lies, cruelty, and the blood of the innocent. She knew that to remain silent was to be complicit. And so, while millions obeyed, Sophie chose to resist. But resistance in Nazi Germany was not an act of defiance, it was a death sentence. Alongside her brother Hans Scholl, Sophie became a leading member of the White Rose, one of the bravest and most remarkable resistance groups of the war. Their mission was not to fight with weapons, but with words, with truth. They printed and distributed leaflets across Germany, exposing the horrors of Hitler's rule, the mass murders, and the lies that kept the people blind. In a nation where fear ruled every home, Sophie and the White Rose called for courage. They risked everything, not for glory, not for power, but for justice, freedom, and the hope of a better future. It was an act of pure defiance, one that the Nazis would not forgive. In February 1943, during one of their most daring operations, Sophie and Hans were caught in the act. The Gestapo wasted no time. They were arrested, interrogated, and put on trial before one of Hitler's most ruthless judges, in a courtroom where the verdict was already decided. But even in the face of certain death, Sophie did not break. She did not plead for mercy. She did not deny her actions. Instead, she stood before her accusers with a fearlessness that stunned even her enemies. On February 22, 1943, just 4 days after her arrest, Sophie was executed by guillotine. She was only 21 years old. But her story did not end there. Her final words, spoken just moments before her death, became a call to arms for generations to come. What does my death matter, if through us, thousands are awakened and stirred to action? She was not just a student. She was not just a rebel. She was a symbol of unwavering courage, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, one voice can make a difference. She stood against one of the most terrifying regimes in history, not with weapons, but with conviction, truth, and the unshakable belief that justice must prevail. Sophie Scholl's story is not just a war story. It is a story of bravery, sacrifice, and the enduring power of conscience. It is a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who hold power, but by those who dare to resist it. This is her story. Chapter 1: A Childhood in Shadows. Sophie Scholl was born on May 9, 1921, in the small town of Fürstenberg, Germany. She entered the world at a time of great uncertainty. Germany was still reeling from its defeat in World War I, burdened by economic hardship and political instability. Though she was too young to understand the turbulence that surrounded her, the circumstances of her birth foreshadowed the struggles she would later face. Her family was unlike many others in Nazi Germany. Her father, Robert Scholl, was a man of integrity and intelligence. He had trained as an accountant and later became the mayor of Fürstenberg, a position that allowed him to witness firsthand the growing dangers of nationalism and extremist ideology. Robert was deeply skeptical of Adolf Hitler from the very beginning, long before the dictator seized complete power. He spoke often of freedom, justice, and the responsibility of individuals to think for themselves, values that would shape Sophie's character in ways no one could have foreseen. Sophie's mother, Magdalena Scholl, was equally influential in her children's lives. A former nurse, she was a gentle, compassionate woman who believed deeply in kindness and humanity. She raised Sophie and her siblings with a quiet but firm moral foundation, teaching them that true strength was found not in force, but in goodness. In a household filled with books, discussion, and debate, the Scholl children grew up questioning authority and seeking truth. Sophie was the fourth of 5 children. Her closest sibling was her older brother Hans, born in 1918. From an early age, the two were inseparable. Hans was daring and full of ideas, always pushing boundaries and seeking adventure. Sophie, though more introspective, possessed an equally strong will. She admired her brother and followed him in many of his pursuits. Together, they climbed trees, explored the countryside, and lost themselves in books of poetry, philosophy, and history. But the world outside their home was changing, and soon, those changes would reach even the quiet town of Fürstenberg. The illusion of patriotism. As Hitler rose to power in the 1930s, Germany became a country consumed by propaganda. The Nazis promised to restore national pride, to rebuild the economy, and to create a future of strength and unity. Schools became places of indoctrination, where children were taught that unquestioning loyalty to the Führer was their highest duty. The Scholl children, like millions of others, were swept up in this tide. Hans was the first to join the Hitler Youth, the organization designed to mold German boys into loyal followers of the Nazi Party. Not long after, Sophie followed, becoming a member of the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM. At first, it seemed exciting, full of adventure and camaraderie. They went on hikes, learned survival skills, and were told they were part of something greater than themselves. Sophie, like many young Germans, believed she was helping her country. She enjoyed the sense of belonging, the patriotic songs, and the enthusiasm of her peers. The Nazis were experts at manipulating emotions, particularly among the youth. They promised a glorious future, one where Germany was strong and pure. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Sophie started noticing disturbing contradictions. At school, Jewish classmates disappeared without explanation. Certain books were banned. Questioning Hitler was not allowed. Teachers who once encouraged independent thought now spoke only the Nazi Party line. Even as a young teenager, Sophie was uncomfortable with blind obedience. At home, she began to hear different voices, the voice of her father, warning against Hitler, and the whispered concerns of family friends who saw the growing darkness in Germany. Robert Scholl, despite his position as a local government official, never hid his disapproval of the Nazis. "This man will bring ruin to Germany, mark my words," he told his children more than once. It was a dangerous thing to say. At first, Sophie struggled with these contradictions. How could something that seemed so full of national pride be wrong? How could people disappear without reason? Why did asking questions feel forbidden? The turning point came when Hans, once a devoted member of the Hitler Youth, began to rebel. The first signs of defiance. Hans had always been strong-willed, but as he grew older, he became more outspoken. He saw firsthand the brutality of the Nazi system. He refused to participate in certain activities, he openly criticized his superiors, and he began seeking out banned books. When authorities noticed, he was arrested for the first time, and not for a violent act, but for possessing a book of banned poetry. This incident shook Sophie to her core. How could a book be dangerous? How could words be a crime? The very ideas her parents had instilled in her, free thought, justice, and truth, were now considered threats to the state. It was during these years that Sophie began her true awakening. She turned away from the League of German Girls, her enthusiasm for Nazi ideology fading into disillusionment. Instead of swallowing propaganda, she began to question everything. She devoured literature that challenged the regime. She read works by great thinkers, Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, and found a world beyond Nazi dogma. She also found comfort in art, music, and philosophy, all of which became sources of strength for her. The more she read, the more she understood Germany was not being saved, it was being destroyed from within. But questioning was one thing. Taking action was another. The journey to Munich. By 1942, Sophie had left behind childhood illusions. At 21, she was a young woman ready to shape her own destiny. While war raged across Europe, she enrolled at the University of Munich, eager to study biology and philosophy. It was there that she reunited with Hans, who had also enrolled at the university after being drafted into the army and serving on the Eastern Front. But what Sophie did not yet know was that Hans had already begun something far greater than university life. In secret, he and a small group of friends had formed the White Rose, a resistance movement that used words, not weapons, to fight against Hitler's regime. When Sophie arrived in Munich, she would soon face a choice that would define her forever. Would she remain a silent observer of history? Or would she join the fight for truth, knowing that it could cost her everything? For Sophie, there was never really a question. She had spent years watching, questioning, and searching for truth. Now, it was time to act. The shadows of childhood were behind her. The battle for justice had begun. Chapter 2: Awakening to Truth. By the time Sophie Scholl arrived at the University of Munich in May 1942, she was no longer the naive girl who had once worn the uniform of the League of German Girls. She had seen too much, questioned too much, and lost too much faith in the Nazi regime. But while she now understood the darkness that had taken hold of Germany, she did not yet know how to fight against it. University life was supposed to be about study, research, and preparing for a future. But for Sophie, it became something far greater, a place where she would awaken fully to the reality of her country's crimes and find the courage to take action. A city of contradictions. Munich, known as the birthplace of the Nazi Party, was a city where Hitler's influence was inescapable. His speeches had once filled the beer halls, and his face was plastered across every wall. The city pulsed with Nazi propaganda, with banners hanging from buildings, and officers marching in perfect formation through the streets. Yet, beneath the surface, there were cracks. Sophie noticed hunger, despair, and fear in the eyes of ordinary citizens. Soldiers walked with haunted expressions, their once proud uniforms stained with exhaustion. The war, which Nazi officials still claimed was going well, was in truth beginning to unravel. At the university, things were no different. Professors who once taught freely now spoke cautiously, careful not to say anything that could be interpreted as disloyalty. Students who dared to question the war disappeared overnight. Libraries had been purged of books deemed UN German. Free thought had become a crime. But despite the suffocating atmosphere, Sophie sensed something beneath the silence, a hidden undercurrent of resistance. The white rose. It did not take long for Sophie to realize that her brother Hans was hiding something. She noticed his sudden disappearances, the way he avoided certain questions, the nervous glances he exchanged with his friends. Hans had always been daring, but this was something different. There was a weight to him now, a burden he carried that he could not easily share. Then, one evening, she found a leaflet in his room. It was a single sheet of paper, covered in dense text. The words were unlike anything she had ever read before. Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct. Surely every honest German is ashamed of his government these days. Who among us has any conception of the number of innocent people who have been murdered in this country? The German people slumber on in their dull stupor, encouraging the criminals. Is it not so? That is why each individual must do his part in the struggle against the system. At the bottom, there was no name, only a signature. The White Rose. Sophie read the leaflet over and over, her hands trembling. She knew in that moment that Hans was part of something dangerous, something that could cost him his life. When he returned at night, she confronted him. "Who is the White Rose?" she demanded. Hans hesitated. At first, he tried to brush her off, telling her it was nothing, that she should forget about it. But Sophie was persistent. She had seen the truth, and she would not let it go. Finally, with a deep breath, Hans told her everything. He and a small group of students, Alexander Schmorl, Christoph Probst, Willy Graf, and their philosophy professor, Kurt Huber, had formed a resistance movement unlike any other. Their goal was not to fight with guns or bombs, but with words. They printed leaflets exposing the atrocities of the Nazi regime, the mass murder of Jews, the brutal suppression of free speech, the senseless slaughter of German soldiers on the Eastern Front. They called upon the German people to resist, to think for themselves, to stand up against Hitler's rule. It was a simple act, but an extraordinarily dangerous one. Speaking out in Nazi Germany was a crime punishable by death. But Sophie did not hesitate. "I want to help," she said firmly. A woman in the resistance. Hans and the others were hesitant at first. They did not want to put Sophie in danger. A single mistake could mean execution, not just for her, but for their entire group. But Sophie was determined. And, in a way, she had one advantage that none of them did. As a young woman, she was less likely to be suspected. The Nazi regime viewed women as passive, obedient, and apolitical. They saw them only as wives, mothers, and caregivers, never as revolutionaries. Sophie knew she could use this to move unnoticed, to distribute leaflets in places where her brother and his friends could not. At first, she started small. She helped type and print the 6th leaflet, working late into the night on an old duplicating machine. Every letter, every word, had to be carefully chosen. One mistake, one phrase that was too revealing, could give them away. Then came the most dangerous task: distribution. Sophie traveled by train, carrying stacks of leaflets in a suitcase, her heart pounding with every stop. She would leave them in mailboxes, slip them between books in university libraries, drop them in telephone booths, scatter them in train stations, and even leave them in lecture halls. Each leaflet ended with a bold declaration: "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The white rose will not leave you in peace." It was an act of pure defiance, and every time Sophie placed a leaflet in an unsuspecting location, she knew she was playing with death. Risk and consequence. As their movement grew, so did the danger. Gestapo officers were everywhere, watching, listening, searching for signs of rebellion. The penalty for treason was clear: arrest, torture, execution. The members of the White Rose knew they were running out of time. The Nazi grip on Germany was tightening. The war was reaching a turning point, but still, too many Germans remained silent. So, they planned one final, bold act: a direct confrontation with the students of Munich. They would scatter thousands of leaflets across the university, calling for students to rise up and resist. It would be the most daring move they had ever attempted. It would also be their last. As Sophie held the final stack of leaflets in her hands, standing in the corridors of the University of Munich on that fateful day in February 1943, she felt no regret. Only conviction. She was no longer a child. No longer a bystander. She had awakened to truth. And she would fight for it, no matter the cost. Chapter 3: The White Rose Rises. By late 1942, the White Rose had grown into something far more than a small student group distributing pamphlets in secrecy. Their words had traveled far beyond Munich, reaching German soldiers on the front lines, university students across the country, and even members of the Nazi government. In a country where speaking out was a death sentence, this was unheard of. It was dangerous. It was revolutionary. And it would not go unnoticed for long. The spread of resistance. The White Rose had begun with a small group of young students, but now, their message had wings. With the help of sympathizers, they smuggled copies of their leaflets into other cities: Berlin, Hamburg, Stuttgart, Cologne. Some even made it into Austria. It was an astonishing feat of defiance in a nation where the Gestapo, Hitler's feared secret police, watched every street, listened to every whisper, and punished even the smallest act of disobedience with imprisonment, torture, or execution. But the White Rose refused to be silent. As winter set in, Sophie, Hans, and their allies printed even more leaflets, each one bolder than the last. They spoke not just of Hitler's lies and crimes, but of the moral duty of all Germans to rise against him. They quoted philosophy, literature, and the Bible, appealing to the conscience of the German people. In one of their most powerful leaflets, they wrote, "We will not keep silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace. The war is coming to an end, and with it, the terrible crimes of our government will be exposed to the world. What will you say when they ask what you did to stop it?" The word spread like wildfire, passed hand to hand in secret, left in public places for strangers to find. Some leaflets were even copied and reprinted by other underground groups, increasing their reach even further. For the first time, Germans were reading open defiance from within their own country. And for the first time, the Nazis were afraid. The Gestapo hunts for the White Rose. The Gestapo had long suspected that someone within the University of Munich was responsible for the leaflets, but they had no names, no faces, no evidence. They interrogated students. They searched dormitories, libraries, and printing shops. They sent informants to spy on lectures and report on suspicious behavior. By early 1943, they knew this resistance was not coming from foreign spies or military deserters, it was coming from German youth. University students. The future of the Reich itself. That made the White Rose more dangerous than ever. And so, the Gestapo increased its efforts. They offered rewards for information. They arrested anyone who was caught distributing pamphlets. They would stop at nothing to silence the White Rose. Are we doing enough? One freezing night in February 1943, Sophie and Hans sat in their shared apartment, going over plans for their next leaflet. A small candle flickered between them, casting long shadows on the walls. The war had reached a turning point. The German army had just suffered a catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, a loss so massive that Hitler himself had declared a national day of mourning. The illusion of Nazi invincibility was breaking. But that also meant the regime was more desperate than ever. The arrests were increasing. The executions were happening faster. Every day, they risked capture. Sophie turned to her brother, her face solemn. "Are we doing enough?" she asked. Hans hesitated. He knew the dangers they faced. He knew their days were numbered. But he also knew what was at stake. "We are few," he admitted. "But if we don't speak, who will?" Sophie nodded. She understood. And she knew they had to do more. A final, daring act. In their previous missions, they had distributed leaflets by mail, in train stations, in random locations, all methods designed to keep them hidden. But now, they needed something bigger. They needed to wake people up. They decided to strike at the heart of the University of Munich itself. On February 18, 1943, with thousands of students attending lectures, they would scatter hundreds of leaflets from the top of the university's central atrium, letting them rain down like snow upon the crowd below. It would be a direct, public act of defiance. It would also be their last. Chapter 4: The Dangerous Last Mission. The morning of February 18, 1943, was bitterly cold in Munich. The streets were still covered in a thin layer of snow, the winter air biting against Sophie's face as she walked beside Hans toward the University of Munich. The siblings carried a suitcase full of leaflets, each page printed with the words that could get them killed. They had done this before. Many times. But today was different. Today, they would take their greatest risk yet. The plan, a bold act of defiance. For months, the White Rose had worked in the shadows, slipping leaflets into mailboxes, leaving them in train stations, passing them hand to hand in secret. But despite their efforts, despite the thousands of pages they had distributed, the majority of Germans remained silent. It wasn't enough. Sophie and Hans knew that if they truly wanted to make an impact, they needed a public act of resistance, one that would force people to take notice. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They would spread hundreds of leaflets throughout the university, in lecture halls, on staircases, on window sills, ensuring that every student, every professor, every passerby would see the truth about Hitler's regime. But before leaving, they would do something even bolder. They would go to the top floor of the university's main atrium and throw stacks of leaflets into the air, letting them rain down like snow upon the students below. It would be impossible to ignore. It would be a message that no one could pretend not to see. And it would also be the moment that sealed their fate. Executing the plan. They entered the university just as classes were beginning, blending into the crowd of students moving through the hallways. Their hearts pounded in their chests, but their faces remained calm. Sophie carried the stack of leaflets hidden inside her coat, while Hans gripped the heavy suitcase filled with more. They worked quickly, moving through the empty corridors, slipping leaflets onto benches, desks, staircases, and window sills. Hans left a pile outside a lecture hall, knowing that students would step out and find them. Sophie placed them carefully on the steps, making sure they were visible. They moved with precision, knowing they had only minutes before someone noticed. Then, just before leaving, Sophie stopped. She looked down at the atrium below, a wide, open space where dozens of students were walking, talking, heading to their classes. This was it. She pulled out the remaining stack of leaflets, walked to the top of the staircase, and with one swift motion, flung them into the air. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The white pages twisted and turned as they floated downward, catching the light from the high windows. One by one, they landed on the floor, on students' shoes, on books and coats. Some students looked up, confused. Others picked up the papers and began to read. A murmur spread through the atrium. People were reading the words of the White Rose. It was exactly what Sophie had hoped for. But then, a single moment of bad luck changed everything. The moment of betrayal. A movement caught Sophie's eye. Across the atrium, standing in the shadows, was a man watching her. It was the university janitor, Jacob Schmid. A loyal Nazi and a staunch believer in Hitler's ideology, he immediately recognized the leaflets for what they were: treason. His face twisted in rage as he took a step forward, eyes locked onto Sophie and Hans. Then, without hesitation, he turned and rushed to call the Gestapo. The arrest. Sophie and Hans had mere moments before the Gestapo arrived. Realizing their mistake, they turned to leave, trying to blend back into the student crowd. But it was too late. Nazi officers stormed the university within minutes, sealing off all exits. A quick search of the building led them to the leaflets, and then, to Sophie and Hans, who were still holding the empty suitcase. They were cornered. The soldiers grabbed them, twisting their arms behind their backs. Sophie bit her lip, refusing to cry out. Hans, always protective, tried to take the blame, saying that Sophie had nothing to do with it. But the Gestapo wasn't interested in excuses. They had caught 2 traitors in the act, and that was all they needed. With guns pressed to their backs, Sophie and Hans were dragged out of the university, past students who watched in stunned silence. Some lowered their heads, too afraid to look. Others picked up the leaflets, reading the words that had just condemned their authors. As Sophie was shoved into the waiting car, she turned back one last time, her eyes meeting those of the students watching her. She had no regrets. The White Rose had spoken. And now, the world would have to listen. Chapter 5: Betrayal and Capture. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind Sophie Scholl as she was led into the Gestapo headquarters in Munich. The walls were thick, the air damp, the room cold despite the fire crackling in the corner. She knew this place well, not personally, but by reputation. Once inside these walls, few ever left. A Nazi officer shoved her into a chair, his grip bruising her arm. She winced but said nothing. Across the table sat Robert Moore, a seasoned Gestapo interrogator. He was a man who had broken hundreds of prisoners, reduced them to tears, to confessions, to betrayals. But as he looked at the 21-year-old woman before him, something unsettled him. She did not look like the typical enemy of the state. She was young, delicate, unarmed. Yet there was a quiet steel in her eyes, something that told him this interrogation would not be as easy as the others. The first interrogation, a battle of wills. Moore leaned forward, placing a copy of the leaflet on the table. "This was found in your possession," he said. "Tell me who wrote it." Sophie remained silent, her hands resting in her lap. She could hear the faint echo of boots in the hallway, other prisoners being dragged through the corridors. She had known this moment would come, she had prepared for it. Moore's voice hardened. "We already know everything," he lied. "Your brother has spoken. Give me names, and I can help you." At that, Sophie smiled slightly, a small, almost amused smile. She knew Hans would never betray their cause. "I take full responsibility," she said. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "I know what I did." Moore narrowed his eyes. Most prisoners begged for mercy. Most tried to make deals, to shift the blame. But Sophie? She did not flinch. Moore exhaled, rubbing his temples. He was used to breaking men, grown men, trained soldiers, resistance fighters. But this young woman sat before him like an immovable mountain. He tried a different approach. "You are an intelligent girl, Fraulein Scholl," he said, his tone softening. "You have your whole life ahead of you. This is foolish. Tell me what I need to know, and I will see to it that you are released." Sophie's expression did not change. "If you think I will betray my friends, you do not understand me." The second interrogation, breaking the silence. For hours, Moore pressed her with questions. He tried to intimidate her, raising his voice, slamming his fists on the table. He tried to manipulate her, telling her that Hans had already confessed. He tried to reason with her, saying that she was too young to throw her life away. But Sophie met every accusation, every threat, every falsehood with calm, deliberate defiance. "You are fighting a lost war," she told him at one point. "You cannot win against the truth." Moore clenched his jaw. He was losing patience. He knew what happened to prisoners who did not confess. Finally, he gave the order, "Search her apartment." The Gestapo raided the Scholl family home, tearing through her belongings, looking for evidence. And then, they found it, a handwritten draft of one of the White Rose leaflets. They brought it back to her, slamming it down on the table. "Explain this," Moore demanded. For the first time, Sophie hesitated. She had been so careful. Had she made a mistake? Had she left it out in the open? Or had someone else been careless? It didn't matter now. The evidence was undeniable. Still, she refused to betray anyone else. "I wrote it," she said simply. She didn't. The leaflets were the work of the entire White Rose, but Sophie knew, if she admitted to it alone, she might protect the others. The fate of the White Rose. But Sophie was not the only one captured that day. Hans Scholl sat in a separate interrogation room, his knuckles bloodied from the struggle during his arrest. He, too, was being questioned. Hours later, Christoph Probst, another member of the White Rose, was arrested as well. The Gestapo had found one of his handwritten notes in Hans's pocket. It was all the proof they needed. The three of them were now in the hands of the Gestapo, and the Nazis wasted no time in deciding their fate. A moment of defiance. That evening, Sophie was dragged back to her cell, exhausted but unbroken. The walls around her were bare stone, the air thick with the scent of fear and dampness. As she sat on the wooden bench, staring at the small, barred window, she thought about what would happen next. She knew that the Nazis did not keep prisoners like her alive for long. She thought about her parents, about her younger siblings, about the life she would never get to live. But she also thought about the thousands of leaflets still out there. The ones they had already sent. The ones that could not be destroyed. She thought about the words she had written, and how they would continue to spread, even after she was gone. The next morning, her trial was announced. It would be held in just 2 days. Her fate was already sealed. Chapter 6: The Trial of Courage. The doors to the People's Court swung open with a crash, and Sophie Scholl was led inside, her hands bound in front of her. She did not flinch at the sound. Beside her walked Hans Scholl and Christoph Probst, their faces pale but determined. Around them, Gestapo officers stood like statues, their cold eyes fixed on the 3 young prisoners. The air smelled of sweat, ink, and the faint trace of cigarette smoke. At the far end of the courtroom sat Judge Roland Freisler, a man infamous for his violent temper and theatrical outbursts. He was Hitler's most feared judge, a man who had sentenced thousands to death in trials that lasted mere minutes. Above him, the swastika flag hung like a symbol of inevitable doom. The trial had begun. A court of injustice. The charges were read aloud. Treason. Seditious propaganda. Aiding the enemy. Each word felt like a hammer falling on an anvil. Sophie stood rigid and defiant. Her mind raced back to the moment she had thrown those leaflets into the air, the moment she had chosen open rebellion over silent obedience. She had known then that this might be her fate. Now, she faced it. Freisler's voice boomed through the courtroom. "You, Sophie Scholl, have committed the gravest of crimes against the German Reich. Your words are a poison, your ideas a disease. You sought to turn the German people against their Führer. This is high treason." Sophie did not lower her gaze. Instead, she met his eyes, her voice steady when she answered. "What we wrote and said is what you all think, too. You just don't have the courage to say it out loud." Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. For a moment, there was silence. Even Freisler, infamous for his explosive fits of rage, seemed caught off guard. The Gestapo officers shifted uncomfortably. They knew the truth of her words. Then, Freisler erupted. "Silence," he roared, slamming his fist onto the bench. His face twisted with fury, spittle flying from his lips. But Sophie had already won something in that moment. She had exposed them, exposed their cowardice, their lies, their fear of the truth. Hans speaks the final words of the White Rose. Freisler turned his attention to Hans Scholl, who stood beside his sister. "You have betrayed your nation. Have you nothing to say for yourself?" Hans lifted his head, his voice calm but firm. "If we must die, then we are not the ones who should be ashamed. You will see, our ideas will not die with us." Freisler slammed his gavel down. "You will be executed today," he spat. "All three of you, by guillotine. Your names will be erased from history, and no one will remember you." Sophie's lips curled into the faintest smile. She knew that Freisler was wrong. A whisper of defiance. As the guards dragged her from the courtroom, one man stepped forward, a prison officer, one of the few who had not yet been broken by the regime. He whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "Brave girl. You will not be forgotten." Sophie paused, turning her head ever so slightly toward him. She did not reply. But she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. She already knew it to be true. Even in death, their voices would live on. And so, on February 22, 1943, Sophie, Hans, and Christoph were led to their final fate. Chapter 7: A Legacy That Cannot Die. The cold stone walls of Stadelheim prison seemed to close in as Sophie Scholl was led down the dimly lit corridor toward the execution chamber. The rhythmic sound of boots against the floor echoed with an eerie finality. Her hands were bound in front of her, but her spirit remained unbroken. The prison guards, hardened men who had seen countless executions, expected fear. They had seen prisoners weep, beg, collapse under the weight of their fate. But not Sophie. She walked calmly, her head held high. There was no trace of terror in her eyes, only certainty, defiance, and something even more unsettling to her captors, peace. Even in these final moments, she refused to give the Nazis what they wanted, her surrender. The last walk of the White Rose. The execution chamber was small and sterile, with a wooden bench against the wall and a single chair beneath the guillotine's gleaming blade. In the corner stood Hans Scholl and Christoph Probst, already sentenced to die. They had been given mere hours to say goodbye to the world. Hans turned when he saw Sophie enter. His face lit up, not with fear, but with pride. "Soon we will see each other again," he said softly. Sophie nodded, gripping his hand one last time before she was led away. The executioner asked if she had any final words. She took a breath, glanced toward the window where sunlight streamed in, and smiled. "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. What does my death matter, if through us, thousands are awakened and stirred to action?" The executioner hesitated for a moment, as if something about her words unsettled him. Then the order was given. At 5 p.m. on February 22, 1943, Sophie Scholl was executed by guillotine. She was 21 years old. Moments later, Hans was led to his fate. As the guards positioned him beneath the blade, he shouted with all his strength. "Long live freedom!" Then, silence. The blade fell. Christoph Probst followed soon after. By 5:15 p.m., the White Rose had been silenced, at least, in body. But their words would live forever. The echo of her words. The Gestapo confiscated every leaflet they could find, burning them, shredding them, destroying every last piece of evidence. They thought they had erased the White Rose. They were wrong. News of Sophie's trial and execution spread like wildfire. Prison guards, witnesses, even Nazi officers who had seen her defiance whispered about the young woman who had faced death without fear. In the months after their deaths, Sophie's final leaflet was smuggled out of Germany. A copy made its way to Allied forces, who reprinted it by the millions. British planes dropped thousands of copies over German cities, ensuring Sophie's voice reached the people she had died for. She had not died in vain. A name that would never be forgotten. After the war, when Hitler's Reich lay in ruins, and the world finally saw the horrors of what the Nazis had done, Germany began searching for its heroes, the ones who had resisted, who had spoken up when others remained silent. One name stood above the rest. Sophie Scholl. Today, her legacy is woven into the fabric of Germany. Streets, schools, and universities are named in her honor. Statues and memorials stand in remembrance of the White Rose. Every year, students across Germany study her words, her courage, and her sacrifice. In Munich, where she had once stood on the university steps throwing leaflets into the air, a bronze memorial now marks the spot, a testament to a young woman who, in the darkest of times, chose truth over silence. The Nazis had tried to erase her. Instead, she became a symbol. Because of Sophie Scholl, the world remembers. One voice can change everything.